Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy today's episode.
Although Chen Ming has such an idea, but the difficulty, it can only be said that it is no different from open robbery. The individuals responsible for manufacturing work cannot contact the outside world, and Chen Ming basically has no way to control it. And there are strict isolation measures inside and outside the material transportation and management departments. Chen Ming doesn't know whether such strictness is aimed at him. In short, he has indeed infiltrated part of this place, but not completely. Overall, it looks like this, neither up nor down. It can be said that there is no opportunity to actually contact the new star level. And it's not just a problem of contact difficulty. Chen Ming has other troubles to deal with. Even if he successfully finds an opportunity later and sacrifices a part of the individuals under his control to successfully contact the module of the battleship and connect it in. But controlling the battleship is far from enough from Chen Ming's heartfelt feeling. Forced control will only cause damage to the individuals of the Afterglow who helped Chen Ming control the battleship, and his own mental power will also be impacted. As far as Chen Ming knows, although Yuhui's battleships are controlled by Alpha-class Yuhui-like cruisers, but the battleships require a lot of real-time computing power during battles, and individuals who have just reached Alpha level are absolutely not capable of it. Only those who have been promoted to Alpha level for a long time and have a greater increase in computing power can control the battleship. Even Hui Huang is not qualified to control the battleship at present. Only the Alpha-class Yuhui that Chen Ming controls later, which is located in the border star field between Yuhui and the mechanical race, may have a certain possibility, but it is only a possibility. Battleships and cruisers are not at the same level at all. At the cost of losing an Alpha-class Yuhui, in exchange for a high probability of failure to control the Yuhui battleship, this is a sheer loss. So Chen Ming's idea in this regard was immediately discouraged by the high price. And even if he wanted to indirectly control this new star-level ship by controlling the entire shipyard and the entire giant dock, it would not work. Not to mention that the different blocks inside the giant dock are also isolated. Let's just say that the size of the giant dock itself is already larger than the main battleship. So now, Chen Ming can only temporarily give up this tempting idea. First, try to control the modules of the giant dock piece by piece. At that time, whether to find a way to slowly and completely control the giant dock or to help Bai Quan, it depends on the specific situation at that time. Just when Chen Ming had such an idea and immediately rejected it, Hui Huang suddenly took the initiative to contact him through the emergency contact method that Chen Ming had discussed with him before. Chen Ming immediately focused his attention on Hui Huang and asked, "What's the matter?" "I just received an order to remotely access a cloning institute that is conducting experiments on your clones. The cloning experiment in the laboratory has entered the final stage, and your clones have been cultivated to the end. I need to help select the individuals suitable for implanting your spiritual nerves." "Oh," Chen Ming replied calmly. It can only be said that even if he didn't know about this kind of thing, he could guess that Yuhui must have done it. However, Hui Huang added again, "Also, the laboratory successfully cloned a special thing with psychic power." Chen Ming perked up and asked, "Thing? Not a psychic clone?" "No. Part of its clone's body tissue has mutated and has psychic power, more like some kind of psychic creature." Chen Ming couldn't understand what Hui Huang was saying, but he immediately saw the picture of the cloning research institute that Hui Huang had saved before. He didn't feel anything about the corpses in the cold storage that were against his face. Although the dissection picture of the corpse almost made him unable to hold back, as long as Chen Ming thought clearly that it was just against his face, it would be over. However, when Chen Ming saw that the deformed flesh and blood tissue was taken out of the clone's chest and was still beating slightly, Chen Ming really couldn't hold back. Not only was there the impact of this picture, but also an inexplicable emotion that suddenly arose for no reason affecting him. It was as if this mass of flesh and blood was a part of him. Although strictly speaking, it was the product of his gene cloning. But this mass of deformed flesh and blood that was still slightly moving did not look like the same species as a normal human like him, let alone close. Chen Ming suppressed his inner emotions and asked Hui Huang, "So where is this research institute?" "It's underground." As soon as Hui Huang said this, Chen Ming subconsciously wanted to look down at the floor, but he immediately reacted and restrained this action. Hui Huang was obviously referring to the underground of his research institute. Chen Ming knew that there was something under the institute, but he didn't expect that in addition to his spirit stone, there was actually a cloning laboratory underground. This was important news for him, because the flesh and blood tissue with psychic fluctuations gave him a feeling that, in addition to his instinctive disgust for such things as a human being, he also wanted to take the initiative to contact them. Chen Ming's feeling had saved him and helped him several times, so this time he chose to believe in this feeling. Chen Ming's mind immediately thought about how to go deep underground and find this flesh and blood tissue. And Hui Huang added at this time, however, according to G3, the above-ground institute and the underground institute are separate, and you need to enter and exit from other locations. The specific location is here. Hui Huang marked a location on the planet's topographic map, some distance away from the institute. Fortunately, it was not too far, and it was not unacceptable. But the more important point in Hui Huang's words is, G3? It's here too? Yes, it's monitoring you while also controlling this cloning lab, and its core is underground. A cold light flashed in Chen Ming's eyes, and he had not forgotten what G3 had done before. Although his psychic power allowed him to control G3, G3's situation was very special. Chen Ming couldn't put it on the same level as other Yuhui individuals. At the same time, he was not willing and not used to letting other conscious beings that could be considered living beings be his slaves. So G3 should just die, out of sight, out of mind. Or, Chen Ming was considering whether he could try it. Is there any way to erase Yuhui's memory and personality? Yuhui is a life, not a rigid machine. They also have these abstract things, and they are stored in their cores. It should be possible to try. These thoughts flashed through Chen Ming's mind quickly, and then he remembered all that Hui Huang said, and then asked, "Are there any other situations?" "Not yet. I am currently required to leave the Cloning Institute. And G3 is still reporting this organ tissue with psychic fluctuations to the superiors, and the subsequent things to be done must wait for the superior's orders. I will tell you as soon as there is a special situation." "Okay, keep paying attention. If you have time, find a way to help me investigate some information about your battleships. I can use it." "Understood." Hui Huang disconnected the private communication with Chen Ming. He continued to work in public. And a day later, under the Institute, G3's ongoing investigation of psychic flesh and blood tissue has come to an end. In its database, the report recording this mass of flesh and blood tissue has more than 10 pages on the basis of the previous 2 pages. It can be said that its research on psychic flesh and blood tissue has reached the limit of what the equipment inside the Institute can do. And it has now confirmed the nature of this mass of psychic deformed flesh and blood tissue. Judging from the data performance in all aspects, rather than its previous speculation, it is indeed a psychic creature, not a part of a psychic. However, although G3 has confirmed that the psychic energy of this psychic creature is a protective type of psychic energy, but so far, the specific psychic effect of this psychic creature is still uncertain, and the specific object it can protect is not clear. Because the specific effect of protective psychic energy must be confirmed by dangerous tests. This group of deformed flesh and blood tissue has barely survived in the toxic reagent and low-temperature freezing environment before. New stimulation is likely to kill it completely. But at least for now, G3 can confirm that the toxicity of the reagent it uses and the extreme low temperature are the 2 objects that can be confirmed as psychic protection. As long as this group of deformed flesh and blood tissue is recultivated for a period of time, it will have enough activity and vitality. G3 can extract samples from it and conduct acceptable dangerous tests, although it will be very difficult to get accurate results at that time, because this group of flesh and blood with psychic fluctuations only has the most basic reflex actions, that is, the instinctive movement of the nervous system. It has no self-awareness at all and cannot help with the psychic test. But even so, G3 does not want to let other individuals study it. Once the research on such a cloned psychic individual has results, this result will be epic-making for them, Yue. But after he reported the data yesterday, it is still waiting for the response from the top. This matter is not decided by it in the end. And because Yu cannot become a psychic, although he has studied psychic, it is not in death. So they are very concerned about finding a way to control psychic. They must treat their first cloned psychic product with caution and seriousness. Therefore, the top leaders of this Yu star field need to contact the main force. Just like the encounter with Chen Ming, a psychic who had a profound influence on Yu. So the time required for preparation was naturally prolonged. However, one day after G3 reported the matter, it finally received a reply. The top leaders of the Yu star field, several alpha-level Yu who controlled the Kleka supercomputer, sent the order about this group of psychic creatures directly. Reconfirm the situation of the psychic biological sample, tentatively named psychic deformed myocardial tissue, and verify the accuracy of the data. Save a copy of the data recorded during the entire cultivation process, restore the cloning environment, repeat the cloning experiment, and try to replicate the process of the psychic creature. The psychic biological sample is temporarily stored, and its activity must be guaranteed, waiting for subsequent units to receive it. The sample needs to be transported to the main star field for research. After completing Chen Ming's task, the individual can apply to return to the main star field and join the research on psychic creatures. Such a long list of orders is acceptable to G3. The replication experiment must be done by an individual, and it is the individual who personally made this psychic creature, so the task will definitely fall on his head. And it will definitely not be avoided when studying this psychic creature in the future. So G3 accepted the order. The deformed flesh and blood tissue, whose vital signs had stabilized yesterday, was isolated in a separate room in the Cloning Institute. At the same time, G3 also moved a culture cabin over to ensure its survival. In addition, G3 discovered during previous research that this mass of flesh and blood tissue seemed to have some instinctive behaviors, such as craving for nutrients to restore its previously damaged tissue cells. So G3 stored a large dose of mixed nutrient solution necessary for human survival in the culture chamber. After all, it was transformed from a part of the organs of the clone, and it would need everything that humans need. As long as the concentration was normal, there would be no problem. After completing these tasks, G3 began to restore the process of the previous cloning experiment based on the data records and video records of the previous experiments. Although the probability of success of the experiment itself is very low, so low that it can be ignored. Because the fact that the stem cells of the clone body are not the same is already an unsolvable problem. So G3 did not think that the replica experiment would succeed, but it still did it normally and did 2 copies at the same time. Not only to complete the task, but also to have a glimmer of real hope. And for one of the experimental materials, G3 used the DNA material left by Chen Ming when he lived in their factory some time ago to clone stem cells, which is the default configuration. The other one is that it extracted a very small amount of cells of deformed flesh and blood tissue, and after checking and confirming that these cells are the same as the cells of the normal Chen Ming clone, use the ordinary cells of the deformed flesh and blood tissue to clone stem cells, and then carry out subsequent experimental operations. This is also a means to increase the success rate. The subsequent work is not troublesome. That is, all the stem cells of the 2 experimental samples are designated to the heart organ for differentiation. At the same time, it is also strictly controlling the cultivation environment of the clones to be the same as before. Next, just wait for the deformity to appear, and this experiment will have a successful start. But in the batch of clones that produced this group of deformed flesh and blood tissue, only one clone had the problem of heart deformity. The others either developed normally or had problems in other places, which basically did not affect the heart. So whether the heart deformity occurs or not can only be determined by probability. Now, in these 2 ongoing experiments, each has a standard 50 clones as the final output. In the case that G3 only needs to see whether a deformed heart can be cultivated and does not need to fully cultivate the clones, it only takes a few hours to get the results. However, under the control of the stem cell-directed differentiation inducer in the cloning experiment process, none of the first batch of 100 clones showed any distortion when differentiating myocardial tissue. All of them completed the differentiation normally according to the original planned process and can continue the differentiation of other body tissues at any time. In other words, all the experimental products in this first batch were considered failures. Their results can only be disposed of by injecting reagents. Of course, G3 still maintained a certain degree of attention to these waste products this time to avoid the same situation as before. After uploading the results of this batch of experiments, G3 also received a reply quickly. The senior management asked it to conduct experiments again until the materials stored in the institute were used up. And there will be additional materials delivered later, and they will also take away the psychic flesh and blood tissue as samples at that time. The materials themselves do not require too much time to prepare. But it is troublesome to send the samples across the entire human empire back to the main star field of Yuhui, and to ensure the survival of the samples throughout the process. So they still need to prepare for a while. G3 has nothing to say and continues to accept orders as usual. In addition to continuing to monitor Chen Ming on a daily basis, conducting cloning experiments has become something it needs to do all the time. It quickly replaced the nutrient solution and various additives in the culture chamber that cultivated a bunch of waste products and began the second batch of experiments. Soon, the result was also a failure. G3 did not have any extra thoughts, except for taking a look at Chen Ming, who had been holding a terminal and reading it, and continued to execute the next experiment according to the order. Until 2 days later. Among the sixth batch of experimental samples, G3 finally waited for a clone. And in his body, the heart deformity appeared again. The total number of clones G3 has made has exceeded 500 at least. In the end, only 2 people, including the previous one, had heart deformities with a probability of 0.4%. This is actually a very high probability. But obviously this is only the probability of heart deformities, and the possibility of psychic power is not that high. The second individual with heart deformities did not have psychic power fluctuations like the previous clone. However, the steps of the cloning experiment have not been completed. The individual before G3 was abandoned when it was close to the final stage of cultivation. During the cultivation process of the previous clone, it believed that this clone could still be repaired, so the first time it found that the heart was deformed, it first repaired part of it with surgery and then continued to cultivate. It was not until the clone was completely cultivated into an adult that it was completely determined that the heart deformity could not be repaired, so it abandoned him. So now, G3 needs to continue to cultivate in order to ensure the same process. Wait, that's not right. Just as G3 was about to continue to cultivate this deformed individual alone, it suddenly found that the psychic power fluctuation detector next to it jumped. The instrument detected psychic power fluctuations. And it was not the deformed flesh and blood tissue placed somewhere else. The psychic fluctuation came from the heart in the incubator that had just finished the cultivation stage and was only slightly deformed. As an afterglow, G3 also felt a long-lost excitement. It immediately recorded the data of the cultivation process and prepared to report to its superiors. However, suddenly another psychic fluctuation came from another clone, and it was also from the position of the heart. The monitoring equipment of the incubator of another clone immediately displayed the scan data. This clone had already started and had entered the final stage of cultivation. It was originally intended to be used as a candidate clone for Chen Ming's spiritual nerve transplantation. His originally intact heart suddenly showed a strange deformity, just like the deformity of the deformed flesh and blood tissue. Then, the third psychic fluctuation appeared, and this situation occurred in another incubator. Then the fourth, fifth, sixth. The hearts of dozens of clones all showed deformities at the same time, even though their hearts were very healthy and intact just a few seconds ago. G3 felt the danger in this strange situation. It immediately cut off the power supply of the life support system of all the culture chambers, injected a large amount of toxic reagents into the interior of all the chambers, and sent a report to the outside world. However, the power outage was of no use to these things that had already taken shape, and the toxic reagents did not have the effect they should have. Those deformed hearts were not affected at all, and the increasingly frequent and dense spiritual energy fluctuations they emitted seemed to have some kind of resonance. The spiritual energy fluctuations became more and more intense, and the external communication device of the Clone Research Institute was seriously interfered by the spiritual energy fluctuations, and G3's information could not be sent out at all. It could only deal with this problem personally. But in just a dozen seconds, the hearts of these twisted and deformed clones seemed to be due to the same genes from Chen Ming and the influence of the spiritual energy fluctuations that were now resonating. Their own heartbeat frequencies were also beginning to converge from chaotic and uneven rates to unified. It was as if now dozens of hearts grown by the Cloning Institute suddenly connected their blood vessels together. The flesh and blood tissues and veins and arteries intertwined together to form a huge, deformed heart. This scene had a weird feeling that G3 couldn't describe. This was the first time in its life that it felt this kind of emotion. And what was worse was that the power system of the Institute suddenly had an unknown fault, and the entire Institute's face system was completely paralyzed. The heavy heartbeat and the psychic fluctuations emitted by the heartbeat echoed in the Dark Institute. Only the independent security line was still running, allowing G3 to see everything in the Institute through monitoring. At this moment, G3 heard the sound of the glass of the culture chamber being hit. The first deformed heart in the subsequent cloning experiment it conducted had already moved on its own, violently and continuously hitting the culture chamber. Its myocardial tissue was damaged by the impact, and a large amount of blood gradually dyed the liquid in the entire culture chamber red. Even with night vision and thermal imaging effects, the monitoring system could not see the situation in the culture chamber clearly. Only a group of twisted monsters could be vaguely seen trying to break free from its cage. Fortunately, the strength of the culture chamber was very high, and the actions of the newly cultivated deformed heart seemed to be in vain. But then, a sound of flesh being torn apart reached G3. The chest of another clone whose heart was affected and deformed was torn open, and flesh and ribs protruded out. A twisted, psychic creature that was exactly the same as the first psychic deformed flesh and blood tissue that was discovered emerged from it. It had a stronger cell tissue structure than the deformed heart that had just been differentiated. Just one collision that caused a large amount of blood to spill left a conspicuous crack on the culture chamber. G3 immediately activated the security system in the Institute. A large number of weapons suddenly appeared on several robots that were still in the process of cultivation, and several fixed turrets were turned out from different walls inside the Institute. They started to clean up the inside of the culture chamber directly. Lasers, flames, bullets, and flesh and blood splashed in the wide and dark Clone Institute. These newly born deformed flesh and blood tissues are still very fragile, and even as psychic creatures, they cannot withstand the firepower coming from all directions. But if you look closely, you will find that some of the splashed flesh and blood are still moving. They moved and seeped into the gaps of the isolation doors between different rooms in the Institute. They tended to block the direction of the room where G3 abandoned the abandoned clones, as well as the direction of the deformed flesh and blood tissue at the beginning. G3 had no time to stop all the scattered flesh and blood. In the freezer, a large number of dead bodies began to show signs of life. Even some clone bodies that had been dead for an unknown period of time had the same situation as the clones in the incubator outside. The chest of the corpse had a blood hole, and the heart inside was missing. Only by the blood stains left on the vents in the corner of the cold storage room can we guess where they went. And G3 lost control of the Institute almost in the blink of an eye, even with a large number of armed robots. Because at this time, the hearts of all the clones in the entire incubator had broken through the body that was supposed to have them. In the corner of the culture room that the robots could not reach, the muscle tissues of the shredded, deformed hearts began to aggregate, and the granulation tissues adhered the fragments. A huge piece of meat that could no longer be seen. No, it cannot be said that it could not be seen. Because as long as you look down from above, you can see a huge deformed heart growing on the floor of the Institute. G3's feeling just now has become a reality. The huge deformed heart suddenly started beating again. At the moment it beat, violent psychic fluctuations swept across the entire Institute. All the active robots were shut down, wrapped, infiltrated, and shut down by the deformed flesh and blood tissues they were collecting. The institute was completely destroyed, and inside the room where G3's Alpha Class core was installed, which was the most heavily guarded in the entire institute. At some point, some blood gradually seeped into the originally smooth ceiling. The blood dripped onto the silent alloy box in the room that stored the Liar Stone and Whispering Stone. Then a ball of flesh and blood fell from the ceiling. With a sound of blood splashing, the squirming flesh engulfed the box. The next moment, a drop of blood also dripped onto the core of G3. Chen Ming was awakened by the sound beside his ear. When he just woke up and his head was still a little groggy, he thought he was hallucinating. But when he was more awake, he realized that what he heard was real, as if it was a heavy beating sound coming from the abyss deep underground. And this beating sound was accompanied by a dangerous but intimate spiritual energy fluctuation. Chen Ming woke up instantly, and a thought flashed through his mind. What's going on? He quickly checked the time. It was 5 o'clock in the morning on Earth. Since he was the only living person in the institute in Shaoshi, a hamster, needed to rest, the living area was still dark at this time. This added a bit of weird atmosphere to the sound from deep underground. Chen Ming was not scared by such an environment. When the entire institute was shaking due to the vibration caused by the beating sound, he calmly turned on the lights in the living area and immediately tried to sense his Liar Stone, which was located underground and seemed to be at the source of the sound. The Liar Stone, which could be clearly sensed deep underground before, now seemed very vague to Chen Ming, as if there was a heavy layer between them. There is a problem. Chen Ming picked up the small stone lying on his pillow, which still looked like it had not woken up, and stuffed it into his arms. He stood up and walked towards the central hall of the institute. After Chen Ming walked out of the living area, he also found that the robots that usually followed him from a distance when he made any movement in various corners of the hall were all silent, standing there as if they had lost control. Something bad seemed to have happened in the institute. Chen Ming shouted directly, "Glorious!" He waited for 2 seconds, but did not get any response. G3. Chen Ming shouted another way, but also did not get a response. There was only a heavy sound and the vibration that came with it in his ears. Seeing this, Chen Ming used his psychic power to contact Hui Huang directly. This time Hui Huang responded very promptly, "Mr. Chen, is there something wrong so early?" Question mark. Didn't you see the situation at the institute? Huang sensed the emotions in Chen Ming's words and realized that something might have gone wrong with Chen Ming. It immediately explained, "I still have work every day in other galaxies, and the institute will not remain closed 24 hours a day. Even if I want to, G3 will definitely not allow it. So I will only maintain a signal connection with the institute when you are awake and have a normal schedule. So I don't know what happened at the institute now." Huang's statement was indeed correct, so Chen Ming didn't dwell on this issue, and he didn't have time to dwell on it. Then take a look at what's going on here. Ask G3 if it's dead. Got it. But immediately, Hui Huang said, "No, I can't access the institute's network now." G3 didn't give you permission? No, there is no signal. The communication network is disconnected or interfered with. I'm still trying to connect. Huang's words completely confirmed Chen Ming's guess, so he immediately said to Hui Huang, "Don't try. There are violent spiritual energy fluctuations here that interfere with the communication signal. Go and find a way to notify your senior management. There must be a problem here in the institute." Huang temporarily stopped communicating with Chen Ming. Chen Ming fell into a lonely situation again, and the dull beating sound that kept echoing inside the institute also made him feel a tightness in his chest. And this beating sound seemed to be gradually converging with Chen Ming's heartbeat frequency. The feeling of vibration was also becoming clearer and clearer. There must be something right below the institute. But as far as Chen Ming knows, there are only a few spaces for storing giant mechanical bodies under the institute, plus the cloning institute deep underground. When the giant mechanical bodies jumped out before, Chen Ming saw that there were some supporting maintenance and repair facilities in the place where they were stored. But obviously, these facilities are definitely not the source of the current weird heartbeat and psychic fluctuations. Then the answer is obvious. Something must have happened in the Cloning Institute. Hui Huang seemed to have just told him 2 days ago that the Cloning Institute had cloned a thing with psychic power. And he also watched the video that Hui Huang saved at that time. Chen Ming saw with his own eyes that the flesh and blood tissue with psychic power was taken out from the chest of his clone. Wait, chest? Heart? When the deformed flesh and blood tissue was taken out before, Chen Ming's attention was attracted by its distorted appearance, and he didn't pay attention to what it was. At the same time, he did not notice that it was twitching instinctively at that time, which was actually more like beating. It was a deformed heart, not some deformed ordinary flesh and blood. Chen Ming reacted completely at this moment. What was beating under the institute, making violent noises and violent vibrations, was the heart. After thinking of this, an inexplicable panic suddenly enveloped him. Chen Ming felt that he could not stay in the institute any longer, and he had to leave immediately. But at this time, Hui Huang contacted again and said, "We have sent a spacecraft to approach the institute, but the signal is still not connected, and we cannot contact you directly. I suggest you leave the institute first. As long as you don't fly out of the surface of the planet, other afterglow will not attack you." Got it. Huang's words coincided with Chen Ming's thoughts just now. Chen Ming immediately took a step and ran out of the institute. And since they were all leaving, Chen Ming simply did something on the way out. He didn't do anything, just touched all the equipment he could touch along the way and marked them all, including the security system, various robots, and monitoring system of the institute, which he usually didn't touch. These equipment, whether used to protect Chen Ming or the institute itself, are spread throughout the institute and can be touched casually on the way out. In this way, he can take these equipment away at any time through his ability in the future. As long as he finds a suitable colony, he can build a new institute on the spot. And this whole process is controlled by Chen Ming because the monitoring equipment is also completely controlled by Chen Ming. And now the institute is isolated from external signals, so no evidence will be left. Besides, Chen Ming is just marking now, not saying that he will take things away now, and there will be no impact at all. So much so that Chen Ming wanted to send away the most valuable Qiling neural extractor in the underground at this time. It is achieved by relying on his transformation ability, the only way to transform without him completely mastering the relevant transformation technology. When Chen Ming's transformation ability is being transformed, he only needs to replace parts, and Chen Ming happens to have the real parts to be replaced. The transformation ability only requires Chen Ming to know which parts to replace before he can modify them, without having to understand the more complex technology inside. The concept of parts is magnified to equipment, and the situation is the same. Chen Ming can directly treat the existing spiritual nerve extractor as part of the ship's equipment and directly transform it to any of his ships with free space. And his psychic power is ineffective for any living thing, and only the effective part will be taken away when transporting materials. So he doesn't have to worry that his psychic power will cause the things underground to spread out. But Chen Ming thought about it and didn't do it, because it is not sure whether the underground monitoring equipment is still working. Before the last day of Chen Ming's plan comes, it is better to keep this critical ability to directly control equipment without a ship. Let's forget about the equipment for the time being. There is only one life, but Yu Hui definitely found more than one device from the ruins of another civilization. Chen Ming quickly sorted out his thoughts and left the institute without any regrets. Including the time of touching the equipment and running away, it took less than 2 minutes in total. It can only be said that the security system monitoring system of the institute is basically a complete set. If Chen Ming touches a place, it is equivalent to marking the entire system by Chen Ming, which is very convenient. However, in these 2 short minutes, the danger and panic in Chen Ming's perception became more and more intense. He did not dare to stay any longer and quickened his movements. When he ran to the door of the dome outside the institute, he made a set of protective clothing on his body. At the same time, he also replaced the buffalo with a military weapon he picked from his own reserves. When the power grid of the Buffalo spacecraft was almost overloaded, it barely blew open the dome door without afterglow control and protection. In the fierce airflow, the Buffalo took Chen Ming to the spacecraft. The spacecraft instantly rose, allowing Chen Ming to completely stay away from the institute. As the vibration of the ground disappeared and the heartbeat in his ears stopped, Chen Ming's chest tightness was instantly relieved to a considerable extent. Now, only the psychic fluctuations that made him feel complicated were still appearing periodically. However, if it was just psychic fluctuations, it would not be a big deal for Chen Ming, who had been exposed to the extreme psychic pulses of the Liar's Stone for a long time. Just when Chen Ming was thinking about where the Buffalo class should go next, he suddenly saw an engineering ship with afterglow approaching in the air in the distance. However, this engineering ship did not intend to attack Chen Ming, and it seemed that it just wanted to land at the research institute. Chen Ming tried to send a communication request, but the psychic fluctuations near the institute still interfered with the communication signal, and the range of existence was still very large. There was no way to make contact at all. Moreover, the flight trajectory of this spacecraft was quite fixed and rigid. It should be relying on the system inside the spacecraft to drive automatically. It would be meaningless to make contact. I don't know what the use of landing such a spacecraft that should have been considered lost to Yu Hui is. And just when this engineering ship approached the institute at a certain distance, suddenly, an electromagnetic pulse accompanied by a surge in psychic fluctuations swept across the periphery of the institute. The Buffalo class driven by Chen Ming and the engineering ship he just saw were affected by the electromagnetic pulse. Fortunately, Chen Ming reacted very quickly and repaired the damage of the Buffalo class in an instant. The spacecraft shook twice in the sky and returned to normal. But the engineering ship obviously did not receive such treatment. Under the influence of the electromagnetic pulse, sparks broke out everywhere on the spacecraft, and the engine also shut down, and it crashed directly next to the institute. Yu Hui's engineering ship was still of good quality, and the height of the engineering ship when it fell was not too high. After falling like this, only the bottom layer and the bottom armor on both sides were partially damaged. Overall, it looked like there was no big problem. Moreover, the direction from which this engineering ship came was exactly the direction of the entrance and exit of the Cloning Institute underground in the institute that Hui Huang had told him before. So Chen Ming took advantage of the situation and landed next to the engineering ship. After Chen Ming confirmed that there was no danger around, he quickly got off the spaceship. Before he felt the heartbeat and vibration causing chest tightness, he quickly touched the engineering ship and then immediately returned to the Buffalo class. The Buffalo class took off again, and Chen Ming also relaxed a little and looked at the situation of the engineering ship. As he thought, there was no Yu Hui individual on the spaceship, and it was purely operating according to the set navigation plan. In the computer of the spaceship, Chen Ming found the only document. It seems that this document was given to him. After all, Yu Hui knew his ability and knew that he would definitely be able to touch the spaceship. As long as he had contact with the spaceship, he would definitely be able to see the document. As for the content of this document, it was basically a bunch of nonsense. It didn't explain the most critical thing, what happened underground in the institute, at all, and it was not as good as what Hui Huang told him. In short, Yu Hui's meaning was that the institute was now in danger, but they had no way to investigate and rescue this area disturbed by strong psychic fluctuations for the time being. Chen Ming could only find a way to withdraw by himself. Chen Ming knew that high-intensity psychic fluctuations would affect Yu Hui, causing redundant data in their logic modules and eventually leading to Yu Hui's death. So Yu Hui couldn't be rescued and had to run away by himself, which was still within his expectations. It was the prison guards who asked the prisoners to run to a safe place by themselves that made Chen Ming a little nervous. In short, the withdrawal must be withdrawn, and Chen Ming would not do something to seek death for no reason. Continuing to stay at the institute was obviously a suicidal act. But having said that, Chen Ming still wanted to find out what happened underground in the institute, especially the fact that the source of this incident was him, which made him want to find out the whole story. In addition to the deformed heart that fell from his clone, and the psychic fluctuations that exuded a sense of danger and closeness. All of these attracted Chen Ming to understand and deal with this matter. And if Chen Ming continued to fly out in the direction of the crashed engineering ship, he would definitely see the entrance and exit of the Cloning Institute first, and then go out to the place where the interference from the underground institute could not affect. So no matter how you look at it, his subsequent actions would not be able to bypass the Cloning Institute, and he would definitely witness the situation of the Cloning Institute with his own eyes. Since this is the case, Chen Ming just went with the flow. He took the spaceship that was delivered to his door directly. After quickly repairing it through his ability, the engineering ship took off again and caught up with the Buffalo class. Before the second wave of electromagnetic pulses arrived in the underground of the Institute, it flew out of the area around the Institute and flew towards Chen Ming's target. But surprisingly, before Chen Ming saw the entrance and exit of the underground Cloning Institute, the interference in the communication had disappeared. These psychic fluctuations that interfered with the communication signal seemed to exist only in the underground of the Institute and did not affect the entrance and exit of the Institute. Chen Ming just found that the communication signal had returned to normal, and the communication came through brilliantly. It asked in a businesslike manner, "Mr. Chen Ming, how are you now?" Chen Ming thought for a moment and said sarcastically, "If you think it's good that I was woken up by something you made before dawn, then it's good." Huang Hui knew that Chen Ming was not targeting it, so it was very patient and wanted to try to appease Chen Ming. Of course, it was still reporting to Chen Ming in real time the information they had found out from Yu Hui. But it was only a few minutes before and after, and what Hui knew was no different from before. At most, he knew that their top management had already arranged a follow-up plan to investigate and deal with the Cloning Institute. So Chen Ming took advantage of this time to speed up. On the surface, he was hurrying to get away from the Institute, but in fact he was looking for the entrance and exit of the Cloning Institute to prevent Yu Hui from letting him run around when the communication was restored. But Chen Ming didn't need to look for it. Because he had just flown out for a short while, he had already seen a group of extremely bright blood-red biological tissues suddenly appearing on the gray and uneven ground. Although this mass of flesh and blood tissue does not have any spiritual energy fluctuations, its current location and its sudden appearance here all indicate its specialness. Then, under this huge biological tissue, there is a high probability that it is the passage leading to the research institute. When seeing this mass of flesh and blood tissue, Chen Ming took a few photos of it and at the same time completely confirmed the idea in his mind. Sure enough, there was a problem with Yu Hui's cloning experiment on him, and it was probably caused by the mass of spiritual energy deformed flesh and blood tissue in the video that Hui Huang showed him a few days ago. So since the Cloning Institute is now out of touch, and Hui Huang also said that G3 was also down there, it is very likely that something has happened. The loss of an alpha-level Yu Hui is also a very rare thing in this non-large-scale battle, although G3 does have the possibility of survival. However, Chen Ming looked at the mass of flesh and blood tissue squirming out of the underground passage on the ground not far away, which was still growing and completely squeezing out the surrounding gray soil, and it seemed to have extremely strong vitality. Chen Ming felt that there was not much hope. The surface is so crowded, the underground should be even worse. And it is this scene that makes Chen Ming know why cloning experiments are completely banned in the Empire. Now Yu Hui has lost an alpha-class Yu Hui. But if it is on the human side, it is very likely that a senior research team will be lost. Or even more than one. Some research institutes are not necessarily separate buildings, but share a building with other different research institutes, which will definitely cause greater harm. But what happened below is still a mystery. At this time, a Yu Hui engineering ship appeared in Chen Ming's field of vision again. Although this is an engineering ship, it is visible to the naked eye that a weapon is installed on the front side of the ship, and it is also aimed directly at the location of the Underground Cloning Institute. After completely locking the target, the engineering ship opened fire. Chen Ming can see with his naked eyes that there is a line in the barrel of the engineering ship connected to the thing it fired. And using the Buffalo-class sensor, Chen Ming can see clearly what the engineering ship fired. It was a steel nail as thick as an arm. It went straight into the deep underground. It penetrated through countless soil and rock layers and inserted into the research institute. Hui Huang explained to Chen Ming just right, it emits a data beacon anchor point. After hitting, it can read the data inside all devices covered by its signal coverage. The wired connection at the tail can help it resist the interference of the institute's psychic fluctuations. It is usually more valuable to use it in the rescue of underground industrial facilities. It is a test product that was just developed some time ago. I proposed the design idea. At present, all planets with underground workplaces in the star field have prepared this kind of thing. Chen Ming said casually, I guess it was the previous mining field that gave you this idea? Yes. It's a good thing that Hui Huang didn't make this thing before. Otherwise, if Yu Wei came up and made such a thing and entered his collapsed mining field, then Chen Ming's ability would be exposed in advance, and all plans would be ruined. However, this thing also has its disadvantages, because it is forcibly shot deep underground. This means that it is very likely to cause damage to the place it hits. If it is just for rescue, such things that may cause secondary damage will generally not be used. There must be a more optimized product before it can be brought out. The reason why they are now taking out something that is only in the testing stage is probably because the current situation is very wrong, and Yuhui urgently needs such a thing to help them obtain information. But Chen Ming felt that this thing seemed to have some potential for being used as a weapon, and he could talk to Hui Huang about it later. Of course, it was not the right time yet. After the engineering ship fired the beacon into the Institute, it had already begun to read the data of various devices underground in the Institute, and sent these data directly to Hui Huang, the second responsible individual of the Institute. However, this process ended soon because the beacon was suddenly destroyed by something in the Institute. But fortunately, all the results of the investigation had been obtained. Hui Huang also showed all the data files to Chen Ming. From the second deformed heart cultivated by G3, to the hearts of other clones breaking out of the body, to the hearts of the corpses also beginning to show signs of life, and the flesh and blood tissues that appeared in the room where G3 was installed at the end completely connected the whole thing. The situation was already very obvious. There was an accident in the experiment, and all the clones that Yu Hui had originally stored became the seedbed of this kind of psychic creature formed by the deformed heart of humans. Chen Ming now understands better why the Empire banned cloning experiments so strongly. If this situation really happens, it is definitely not a problem of a scientific research building. It is a problem of the entire research park, the entire city, and even the entire planet. If the person handling this matter is slow to respond, the planet may fall completely. Moreover, these things are psychic creatures. Although it can be seen from the fact that G3 easily killed several of them with fire before, their individuals are relatively fragile. But once the number increases, or there is no targeted means, it is also very terrifying. Moreover, the number of psychics has always been relatively small, and it is impossible to take care of every place. It is normal to not be able to respond in time when facing these cloned psychic creatures. I am afraid that similar things have happened in the Empire, and the final loss must be unacceptable. As for what happened during the period of cloning experiments in the human empire, whether it is the same as what Yu Hui is facing now, these two questions have not been answered for the time being. But Chen Ming has sent the photos he just took to the boss by transforming the storage module. If the boss knows about this, there should be a result soon. As for now, Chen Ming asked Hui Huang, so what are you going to do? Since Chen Ming asked this question directly in the communication channel, Hui Huang also replied directly in the communication channel, we plan to discuss it later. It will take some time. Please wait patiently. However, Hui Huang still gave a more detailed reason through Chen Ming's psychic power in private. Because the spiritual nerve extractor in the basement of the Institute is something that the top leaders absolutely do not want to lose at present. So our top leaders are considering whether to destroy the entire cloning institute, including the equipment directly, or to find a way to rescue the equipment and then deal with the problem. The topic we are currently discussing is more inclined to the latter. Yu Hui's approach made Chen Ming, a human, unable to help but say, it's already this time. You also know the reason why the Empire banned cloning experiments before. As a result, you don't want to find a way to deal with it quickly, and you are still entangled in this. And when Chen Ming said this, he always had a feeling in his heart. That is, Yu Hui's thoughts and situations may have happened before. Maybe in the past, when the cloning experiments in the human empire also had problems. Because of the existence of this thing, all the experimenters died, but because the value of the instruments and equipment was too high. So the relevant person in charge has been struggling whether to destroy these psychic creatures and the equipment together. Eventually, the situation became uncontrollable. Although this is just Chen Ming's guess, it seems so far. If the problem that cloning will eventually cause is only as serious as the huge heart in front of him, then as long as it can be handled in time, it should not lead to the entire empire banning cloning experiments. So, either the situation in the past is the same as he thought, and the situation is uncontrollable, or the cloning experiment has more terrible consequences. But what the specific situation is, it depends on whether there are people who are familiar with history and have a certain status to verify it. However, there is no movement from the boss for the time being, probably sleeping, and it seems that we have to wait for a while. Chen Ming doesn't care now. What kind of attitude Yu Hui has nothing to do with him. Anyway, if something goes wrong, it will not be him who suffers, but Yu Hui himself. Hui Huang actually has similar ideas to Chen Ming. It also knows that it must be handled quickly, but the top management is still struggling, and there are obviously reasons for them. So Hui Huang explained to Chen Ming directly, "It may be because the only valuable thing we have now is the chilling nerve extractor. We don't have a second extractor at the moment, and even if we do, it is impossible to send it to this star field again. If the only extractor is damaged in the process of handling this incident, it means that we have lost the opportunity to obtain your chilling nerve. We have been preparing for a very long time, and even fought 2 large-scale battles with battleships for you and the human fleet. Although we won both battles, the losses in the battles were real. With so many losses in front, we can't just give up this device casually. This is the truth, and Chen Ming knows it, but he can't understand it at all. Don't tell the other Yu Hui what I'm going to say next. Just think of it as me just saying it because I can't stand it. Got it?" Chen Ming exhaled and said to Hui Huang, "Although I am in conflict with your Yu Hui now, I still have to say that we should prioritize things. The reasons that made the human empire completely ban cloning experiments are already in front of you. Are you really not afraid of problems? Now we are trying to delay time until the second chilling nerve extractor is delivered." Huang continued to say to Chen Ming in a standard Yue way of thinking, "It is unacceptable for us to just continue to delay time. If we lose the chilling nerve extractor, we will only have 2 choices. One is to kill you directly with violent means to completely cut off the idea of chilling nerve. The other is to use equipment such as a cryogenic hibernation chamber to monitor you. Lock it up, keep it or transport it directly to the main star field, and wait for us to find the second spiritual nerve extractor. The previous method is too costly for us, and there are too many accidents that may occur during the execution of the latter method. You and I are now in an open hostile relationship, and I am just the lubricant on the axle, so that your daily communication relationship with us is not so rigid. And we all know that you can't give up the chance of survival and wait for death because of my existence. You didn't commit suicide because you must have more ideas. We both want to gain benefits from each other, but we can't directly conflict because the time has not come. Although what you have prepared before the last moment is not clear to our top leaders. But they know that if they continue to delay, some problems will definitely occur." Hui Huang finally concluded, "It is because of your existence that our top leaders absolutely cannot give up this spiritual awakening nerve extractor." When Chen Ming was thinking before, he was thinking according to normal human thinking, and indeed ignored the fact that he himself was also a problem for Yu Hui. If Yu Hui were to take his influence into account, then their behavior would barely make sense. If cloning technology is banned because its consequences have a very serious impact on the entire empire, then Chen Ming also has a similar effect on the entire Yu Hui. So the troubles caused by Chen Ming and Yu Hui's own cloning technology are actually the same in a sense. At least the final result may be the same, and Yu Hui will be finished. So in these 2 things, Yu Hui is more inclined to choose Chen Ming. After all, humans have used cloning technology before and are still alive and well, which means that there must be a way to deal with the consequences of cloning technology. But Yu Hui has never heard that humans have encountered a psychic who can completely control the human group. So if we talk about which of the 2 things is more difficult to solve, Chen Ming, who has never had a similar precedent, is indeed more troublesome. However, Hui Huang suddenly added, "But we can't completely rule out that our top leaders chose to deal with this psychic creature. If they really give up the spiritual nerve extractor, there is a high probability that they will act on you in advance." Chen Ming recalled and said, "I remember I asked you before." "Yes, I have been preparing like this." "That's it. Before you act, you will definitely be able to understand the situation faster than me and jump to rescue. But my life is in your hands now." Huang did not directly say that Chen Ming could take over the Hue Huang-class cruiser it controlled at any time. It could hear that Chen Ming's words were just casually said, and it also knew that Chen Ming's life was actually always in his own hands. After a moment of silence, Hui Huang spoke again. "I just received an order. Our top management said that they decided to keep the chilling neural extractor and will not take action against you for the time being. The top management's opinion is that obtaining a second chilling neural extractor and future events are too unstable. We must focus on what we have now, not what we will have in the future." Chen Ming did not comment and asked, "So what are you going to do?" "We currently have a two-stage plan. In the first stage, try to send robots to clean up the flesh and blood tissue at the entrance and exit of the Clone Research Institute and enter the Clone Research Institute through passages or additional roads. After reacquiring the chilling neural extractor, use high-powered weapons to clean the ground. If it fails, go to the second stage and send a cruiser-class mining ship into the planet to destroy the surface. Clear all the soil and rock layers above the underground Clone Research Institute to facilitate follow-up weapons to clean up the Clone Research Institute. Doing so risks destroying the chilling neural extractor, so it will only be implemented if the first stage plan fails." This plan sounds fine. So what's your mission? Due to the interference of psychic fluctuations in the Research Institute, any robot or spacecraft must be controlled by our individuals. But you are still here, you are a threat to all Yuhui individuals, and forcing you to leave now is not the right approach. So the mission given to me by the top management is to make you aware of the dangers below through communication and let you leave here. Okay. Huang Hui's words made Chen Ming think seriously, although he really wanted to find out what happened in the cloning laboratory now. But if he continued to stay here and interfere with Yu Hui's work, it would definitely cause a conflict between him and Yu Hui. It would not be a good thing if he broke up with Yu Hui in advance because of his own reasons. Even if Chen Ming could change the time of departure at any time and let Hui pick him up, Bai Chuan's preparations would not be so easy to change. Bai Quan would need to mobilize tens of thousands of people and at least 2 battleships. It is impossible to change the time just by saying it. There must be at least 2 or 3 days of buffer, and it is definitely too late now. Besides, this is something Chen Ming and Bai Quan agreed on in advance. And if Bai Quan finally achieved victory, the benefits he gained would be much more than what he had to pay Chen Ming in the end, which was equivalent to Bai Quan owing him a favor. This was also something they had tacitly agreed to when they talked before. Even for Chen Ming's own sake, this matter could not be changed casually. Therefore, it was indeed a good choice for Chen Ming to leave and not ask about the follow-up. It was also the safest choice that would not affect the follow-up plan. But before Chen Ming could say his agreement, he suddenly found that there seemed to be a faint influence of spiritual energy fluctuations around him. The source of the psychic fluctuations was deep underground and was still approaching him. It seemed that the things that were originally inside the Cloning Institute had come in along the passage. The psychic fluctuations around him became intense again, and the communication with Yu Hui was cut off again. Did the things below come out? This thought popped up in Chen Ming's mind. But then he found that it was not what he thought. The things below did not come out, but were attracting him. At this time, Hui Huang contacted Chen Ming again through psychic energy and said, "Mr. Chen Ming, are you okay?" "I'm fine, but the things underground in the Institute ran to the exit of the passage, and its own psychic energy affected the outside, so the communication was cut off." "Then you are now?" "No big problem." Not only is it not a big problem, Chen Ming now even feels a sense of closeness. The huge deformed heart below gave Chen Ming the closeness between blood relatives, giving people a full sense of security. Wanted Chen Ming to jump down and throw himself into its arms. But Chen Ming is an orphan, and this feeling makes him feel very uncomfortable. and the sense of danger that appeared in his mind, along with the feeling of closeness, also reminded him all the time that the heart was not something that was easy to get along with. Chen Ming was not fooled at all, and turned to Hui Huang and asked, "Since the situation has changed, are you going to change it now?" "No, we still prioritize dealing with the flesh and blood on the surface." "Okay." Chen Ming responded and was ready to leave. But at the moment he was about to do this, his mind suddenly became dazed. Something was throbbing. It was not Chen Ming himself, but something in his mind. Chen Ming panicked for a moment. Was there something in his mind that he didn't notice? No. Chen Ming suddenly remembered. Before, when his iron ore helped Chen Ming block the ruler's fatal 3 shots and caused itself to be destroyed, there was a psychic fluctuation around the institute. Chen Ming immediately used his psychic fluctuation to sense himself. Then he found that in addition to his own consciousness, there was a faint and blurred shadow in his mind. The shadow seemed to stay in his mind voluntarily and was slowly nourished by Chen Ming's subconscious spiritual energy fluctuations. So Chen Ming had never noticed it. Until now, it suddenly moved. It wanted to go out. It wanted to touch the flesh and blood. Chen Ming felt a real feeling of seeing an existence that was worthy of his life from this shadow. This was what his spiritual energy told him, not the kind of closeness imposed by the outside world. Chen Ming directly tried to use spiritual energy fluctuations to touch this shadow, trying to touch its origin. It was not the dirty flesh and blood tissue derived from Chen Ming's genes. It was a spiritual creature derived from Chen Ming's spiritual energy. It was symbiotic with Chen Ming. It was a ship spirit. Such a term suddenly appeared in Chen Ming's mind. He had never heard of this word, but he just thought that the thing in his mind must be this ship spirit. Chen Ming has always believed in his instincts instead of his brain when it comes to psychic matters. So, he is doing the same thing now. Chen Ming opened the hatch of the buffalo and looked at the huge heart below. The temptation of closeness became more and more obvious with Chen Ming's actions, and the sense of danger also rose with it. However, the degree of danger is actually not as high as when the spiritual nerve drilled into his brain before. Chen Ming was almost unprepared that time, and he almost felt the sense of danger brought about. The current situation is completely different from before, and Chen Ming is well prepared. In his head, the ship spirit seemed to be in a state of excitement. A complete set of power armor instantly condensed on Chen Ming's body, equipped with a jet backpack and a hydraulic buffer system. However, Chen Ming did not jump down directly, but first modified a grenade launcher for the buffalo, loaded with the grenade that Chen Ming had just made. The internal charge was the special explosives he learned from Zhuijing, as well as some concentrated spacecraft fuel that was only used by fuel transport ships when transporting fuel in large quantities. Chen Ming didn't know what the effect would be, but he should know it soon. He aimed the grenade launcher at the huge beating, deformed heart below and pulled the trigger. Since his continued stay here would interfere with Yu Hui's work, Chen Ming simply helped Yu Hui do the job. A grenade the size of a human head instantly pierced into the deformed heart. After a brief silence, bright flames poured out from the gaps in the myocardial tissue. The entire heart was shattered by the impact of the explosion, and the broken pieces of flesh flew out in all directions. On the remaining flesh and blood tissue, a raging fire burned in the vacuum. The spacecraft fuel itself has a considerable degree of flammability, and the fuel-material ratio has its own combustion aid. The effect of highly concentrated fuel that is easy to store and transport is even more exaggerated. Almost in the blink of an eye, the area covered by the grenade explosion firepower was almost only charred ashes. Only a few pieces of broken meat were barely a little undercooked. To be on the safe side, Chen Ming fired another grenade. This time, there was no obstruction. The raging flames completely cleared the remaining parts of the heart. The impact of the second explosion also completely blew away the ashes of the flesh and blood tissue, revealing the passage below that was still covered by flesh and blood with fresh vitality. And at the moment when the flames of the second grenade explosion dissipated, Chen Ming saw a black shadow wrapped in psychic fluctuations turn back and rushed into the passage. That thing should be the source of the violent spiritual energy fluctuations around. A large flamethrower appeared out of thin air in Chen Ming's hand, which he could lift after wearing the heavy power armor. The fuel tank of this thing is also equipped with spacecraft fuel, which is definitely the best helper for dealing with the remaining flesh and blood in the channel. Chen Ming pulled the switch of the flamethrower, and after confirming that the flamethrower could easily spray out a fire snake of more than 10 meters, he adjusted his posture in the power armor. Then, he took a step out. Amid the terrified screams of Xiaoshi, who was holding his neck, and the joy of the ship's spirit in his mind, Chen Ming jumped off the spacecraft. At this moment, the senior executives of Yuhui, who were monitoring this scene through the satellite in the orbit of the star, fell into silence. What is Chen Ming going to do? He wants to enter the institute. Didn't Hui Huang stop him? Before it could contact Chen Ming, interference signals appeared around Chen Ming again, confirming that the psychic deformed myocardial tissue had moved from the cloning institute to the institute exit. What is Chen Ming doing? Unknown. There are several possibilities: the spirit stone, the spirit nerve extractor, or the psychic creature. We don't have the ability to stop Chen Ming for now, so don't worry about him. He won't actively seek death. And since the psychic creature has changed its location, the Institute's communication signal should have been restored. Indeed, I'm trying to connect. The connection is successful. The overall framework of the Cloning Institute remains intact, okay, but the main circuit systems and security equipment have been destroyed. The remaining electricity is available in only 30 minutes. The rooms are the same as the other rooms of the Institute, all of which are covered by distorted myocardial tissues. And the oldest stone of Chen Ming's previous obtained. I suspect that all of the spiritual creatures are interested in us. When interference, Lingnung creatures returned to the Institute from the passage. With the heavy flamethrower leading the way, everything went very smoothly. And every time Chen Ming took a step, a large amount of ordinary metal liquid would flow out from his feet, covering the passage behind him, solidifying and forming a steel passage. In case the passage collapsed or was blocked by something again. It was a retreat that Chen Ming left just in case. The psychic flesh and blood organization seemed to sense that Chen Ming was not a good person and took the initiative to retreat. It was seen that it had retreated to the side of the passage near the Cloning Institute. At this time, the boss seemed to have finally woken up and asked Chen Ming in surprise through the terminal, "Xiao Ming, what's the matter with the photo you sent?" It was Yu Hui who was doing cloning experiments. In the end, I don't know how he made this thing. There are strong psychic fluctuations around it that interfere with the normal operation of communication equipment. I remember your thing. Something similar had appeared during the cloning ban period. But I was dormant during that period, and I don't know much about the details. You have to wait for me to check it out. Anyway, don't come in contact with that thing first. It might be dangerous. Yu Hui has ideas about you and won't let you get close. Chen Ming looked at the half of the passage covered with flesh and blood in front of him and said nothing. The boss immediately found the problem and asked, "You haven't come in contact with it yet? Also, whose genes did Yu Hui use for cloning?" "My genes. If I can get rid of this thing, is it not a big problem?" The boss looked a little anxious and frowned and said, "Let me think about it. I shouldn't interfere with your own affairs, but cloning this thing is a big problem. What should I do?" Chen Ming also thought about it at this time and said, "Actually, I didn't have the idea of contacting it at first." The boss knew that Chen Ming had another but, so he didn't respond. "But there is something in my mind. It should be called a boat spirit, and it wants to contact this thing." "Boat spirit?" After being surprised, the boss immediately asked, "How do you know that the thing in your mind is the ship's spirit? Also, how do you know about the ship's spirit?" Chen Ming had no way to answer the boss's question. He could only answer somewhat ambiguously according to his own feelings. "I am not sure either. I just felt the ship's spirit when I was planning to stay away from that big heart, and then this word popped up in my mind automatically. I only know that the ship's spirit is symbiotic with me and is born from my psychic energy." The boss thought silently for a while and finally chose to believe Chen Ming's words. He had seen Chen Ming's genius in psychic energy. So even if Chen Ming had not undergone systematic learning, had not seen the ship's spirit, and did not know the existence of the ship's spirit, It is very normal to find that the ship spirit is born from psychic energy and coexists with psychics after contacting the ship spirit. Then let me give you a brief account. The ship spirit can be regarded as another life of the psychic, and it is an existence that no one can take away. Just as you know, the ship spirit and the psychic are symbiotic, so it will instinctively protect the psychic. Since your ship spirit is not on the ship, but on you, it means that your ship is gone, right? Your ship spirit should have done something. The previous scene flashed through Chen Ming's mind, and he responded, "Yes, my ship was lost in the previous operation of the 14th Legion, and it did protect me." The boss nodded habitually and continued, "But the value of the ship spirit is not limited to this. It is good in assisting ship control and enhancing the effect of ship AI. And it can also make your spaceship reflect the characteristics of your psychic power, which is the most critical point." Enhance AI? Reflect characteristics? That's right. Enhance AI, this you should understand it well. Cruiser-class ships and above are basically equipped with at least Delta-class AI, with the exception of the Storm class of Tachyon technology. The reason why the ship spirit is called a ship spirit is not only because it comes from the psychic, but also because of its spirituality. The ship spirit is a psychic creature with its own consciousness. Although the consciousness of the ship spirit is relatively simple, it is enough to make up for the lack of personality in the Delta-class AI core. As long as the ship spirit with a simple consciousness can cooperate with the psychic and adjust the computing power of the rigid AI core according to the psychic's wishes, the effect is also very good. And the ship spirit and the psychic are symbiotic, and the ship spirit will never have the risk of betrayal. Of course, this effect is not important to you. The boss knows the effect of Chen Ming's psychic power. No matter how much the ship spirit cooperates with the psychic itself, it is impossible to be more comfortable than the psychic controlling a warship alone. So the boss just talked about this casually and answered another question from Chen Ming. As for the manifestation of characteristics, it is more complicated to explain in detail. Let me give you an example. Suppose there is a psychic who can control fire. If he has a ship spirit and the ship spirit is attached to his spaceship, then the spaceship will show the characteristics of fire in many aspects. Basically related to fire, such as improved engine efficiency, weapons with flames, and spaceship shields will also have similar effects. This is just something I made up casually. It is a fire-type psychic with relatively simple psychic effects. If it is a psychic of other types with more complex abilities, the effects of the characteristics will be very different. When the boss said this, he couldn't help but imagine the future and said, "I am also very curious about what effect your ship spirit can make on your ship. Remember to let the ship spirit live in the new ship when you get it. The supreme point should be very good with your ship spirit." No. The boss suddenly realized the problem and said, "Didn't I just talk to her? Are you talking about the cloning experiment? That's getting off topic. I've already found some news about the period of the cloning ban. I had some impression of these things, and I basically remembered everything after looking up the information." The boss sent a few documents to Chen Ming on the terminal and said to him, "The first cloning experiment that went wrong was a long time ago. I'm afraid you don't understand, so I'll tell you a premise that will make it easier for you to understand. Everything has a spirit, but clones don't, because clones are unconscious beings. But clones exist in the universe like other creatures, and as long as there is life, it is possible to obtain psychic energy. Humans will become psychics, and other creatures will become psychic creatures. And clones may become psychic creatures, not psychics." At this time, Chen Ming was dealing with the flesh and blood tissue in the passage in front of him, while taking the time to look through a few documents given by the boss that seemed to be not confidential enough and could be taken out at will, and at the same time he had to listen to the boss's story. Even though Chen Ming was doing 3 things at once, when the boss talked about this, he still subconsciously asked, "What about vegetative people?" Vegetative people also have consciousness, but the consciousness is very weak and cannot support the body to wake up. Clones are completely different. They skip the stage of normal life development and lack consciousness. Unless the clones are just clone genes to obtain embryos and then give birth through normal means, then there is no problem. Otherwise, it is just a mass of dead meat, something without consciousness. The boss tone was a little disgusted when he talked about clones. In short, if an unconscious being possesses rare psychic power, it is equivalent to a piece of fat meat hanging on the roadside, which will attract some dirty things hidden in some corners. You can understand it as something similar to hyperspace, but in a space that we humans cannot set foot in. These things are a bit like the hyperspace spirits that spacecraft occasionally encounter when sailing in hyperspace. This kind of hyperspace spirit, whose specific image we have not yet been able to investigate clearly, will at most occasionally surround the hyperspace spacecraft and release interference waves to affect the efficiency of the engine. The spirits are not dangerous to humans. At most they are a headache, and the spacecraft can drive them away by releasing a blocking pulse. But the things in that space attracted by unconscious clones are not at the same level as the danger of living in hyperspace. The boss introduced the general situation and began to explain to Chen Ming what had happened. According to the records, the first clone laboratory where the problem occurred had its eyes affected, and this effect is called dimensional infection. Chen Ming interrupted and asked, "Infection? Isn't it parasitic? I thought it was something from that space that escaped." "It's not parasitic. They definitely can't get out of their space at the moment. They can only influence us here by following the traces of psychic energy. In fact, ordinary psychic creatures and psychics can also sense them, but any normal creature will instinctively resist when they sense them. Only clones will be unable to react. The affected clones will have dimensional infection on their body parts. The distorted consciousness caused by those things has become a life. At that time, the situation in the photo you sent over also appeared. The eyes have the same distortion as yours, the heart, right? But the situation is more serious. The spread of this distortion is very terrifying. Ordinary people have no resistance at all. They will be affected if they get close to it. The eyes of all affected people will become living individuals and be separated separately." Chen Ming put his hand on his chest and asked, "I feel a little stuffy in my chest when I get close to the distorted heart. Is it spreading?" "Yes, but you are a psychic, naturally is resistant to this kind of thing. But if it is an ordinary person, the heart would have already distorted and run out by itself when they feel chest tightness. It was like this before. Those living eyeballs scattered after leaving the body, affecting a very wide range. No matter whether it is dead or alive, as long as it has eyes, it will be affected. But can you imagine a habitable planet becoming full of flying eyeballs? Or the entire planet becomes part of the eyes? Even more than that. Just think about the consequences of the dimensional infection breaking out in the prosperous star field. How many people and things died at that time? And the damage caused was unprecedented. We have been fighting with Yuhui for so many years. There are quite high bearing capabilities in terms of losses. Exile. You can drive out our universe and throw all the infected things back to space. Well, probably. The bustling galaxy was infected with dimensions, and this galaxy full of distorted creatures was thrown back by a spiritual person. How strong this spiritual person is at all, but at this moment, Chen Ming's focus is on the other thing. Chen Ming now understood the situation around him. Fortunately, there is no one here in Yuhui. At most, there are only a group of clones. So the damage caused by this cloning experiment was limited to the small area of the Cloning Research Institute. Then, humans should be able to use this method. Find a few galaxies in the edge star field with poor resources and far away from the prosperous star field, and build cloning research institutes on them. With superluminal communication technology, robots and equipment can be remotely arranged for control. If there is a problem, just block the galaxy and find a way to deal with it remotely. If the planet cannot be dealt with, then the small satellites can definitely be dealt with. It must not be difficult to build some research institutes on the satellites. Then why doesn't the Empire do this? Chen Ming knew that the Empire must have a reason not to do this, so he asked the question directly. The boss answered quickly. In fact, there was no cloning ban when we just dealt with the dimensional infection. The ban was issued about half a year later than this incident. Because after dealing with the dimensional infection, the Empire did have similar ideas as you. But all subsequent cloning experiments, all were affected, and all clones were deformed. Although after dealing with the dimensional infection, the subsequent deformation was only the physical deformation of the clones, and there was no impact on the psychic power, the harm caused was relatively small. But no matter how small the harm is, it depends on the overall scale. No matter how small the problem is, if it occurs throughout the empire, it is not a small problem. Guess why? Chen Ming's answer to this matter that he didn't understand at all was, I don't know. The boss obviously didn't expect Chen Ming to guess correctly. Before Chen Ming finished speaking, he said, we believe that the things that cause the dimensional infection have roughly located the Empire's position in the universe through the dimensional infection. So they can continue to exert influence on the entire Empire, and all unconscious clones will suffer. Fortunately, psychic clones are ultimately a low-probability event, and the overall situation is within the scope of what can be handled. However, in addition to the impact on clones, the impact they exert also affects the Empire's newborns on a large scale. Many newborns and even embryos have deformed conditions. They are too fragile. Even if they have complete consciousness, they will inevitably be affected by such terrifying things for a long time. Chen Ming immediately understood the seriousness of the matter, and also suddenly understood what consequences Yu Hui's actions would have on them. Chen Ming was about to ask how this sequelae was solved, but the boss told him what he wanted to ask. It was not until 15 years after the outbreak of this incident that the position between our two spaces deviated as time passed. They lost their position in the Empire in the other space, and this situation gradually eased. It is this complete severance of the terror of human beings in the future that led to the existence of the ban. Yu Hui is doing this now, and we are afraid that there will be a large-scale decrease in newborns again. I will report this matter to you later, and I don't know what will happen next. But we will definitely take big actions against Yu Hui. Otherwise, if Yu Hui grasps this point, our demise will be within these generations. Your ability has a more solid foundation with Yu Hui, so you'd better take action as soon as possible. Chen Ming tried his best to quickly digest this information that normal people would never be exposed to in their lives, and at the same time, he couldn't help asking, are all the recorded documents written in such detail? The boss said casually, because I have nothing to do with you now except talking to you. Talking with other people who know this is always a bit beneficial. The boss suddenly thought about it. The gene provider of the cloning body, that is, the spiritual person, encountered some troubles in the future. Those things may be on the provider of your gene. Going directly to the star domain, it is best to come back. I will take you to the person. Who? But he still had something to say, but I feel fine now. Nothing is wrong. Yeah, that psychic thought so too. What happened later? Did he die? No, he's still talking to me now, and you can see him when you come back. Chen Ming asked with some surprise and uncertainty. President? Yes. Many thoughts flashed through Chen Ming's mind at once. But before he could say anything, he was interrupted by the sudden situation around him. Just when he was talking to his boss, he had unknowingly arrived at the door of the cloning laboratory. And here, there was a thing waiting for him. A person, like a human model. It has no skin all over its body, and if you look closely, you will find that all its muscle tissue is forcibly squeezed by cardiac muscle tissue. Even the eyes are just a ball of flesh and blood forced in. Chen Ming once again felt the chest tightness and the obviously distorted sense of closeness. But what really made Chen Ming feel dangerous was the inside of the research institute behind it. Chen Ming took a photo and sent it to his boss, saying, "Boss, I have something wrong here. I'll talk to you later." He had to concentrate on solving the problem in front of him first. Chen Ming stopped. He could feel the excitement, and greed of the boat's spirit in his mind, as well as the nervousness of Xiao Shi next to him. However, Xiao Shi had shown the potential of psychic power before, and it had been in contact with Chen Ming's Liar Stone and Whispering Stone for almost the same time as Chen Ming, and even had a large amount of fairy tree tea to nourish it. Besides, when Chen Ming felt chest tightness before, Xiao Shi was not sleeping soundly, which also showed the specialness of Xiao Shi. So Xiao Shi itself can actually be regarded as a psychic creature, but the specific effect of psychic power is still unclear. Otherwise, Chen Ming would not have been able to bring it down. Now Xiaoshi can beat a normal adult male without any problem, and its nervousness is more of instinctive nervousness. Chen Ming tilted his head and rubbed Xiaoshi to comfort it, and immediately kept his distance and activated the microsensor he had modified on the power armor. Similar to the sensor of a spaceship, it can simply scan some things. And in the distorted flesh in front of Chen Ming, he saw an alpha-class core connected by flesh and blood tissue, and the two spiritual stones he had lost. The distorted flesh seemed to have sensed something, and suddenly opened his mouth and said in an unclear voice, "You?" However, Chen Ming did not bother about why the core of G3 and his spiritual stone were in the body of this thing, and did not give it a chance to talk nonsense. When it said the first word, the flamethrower raised by Chen Ming had already spit out a fire snake in front of it. The red flame instantly wrapped around the distorted flesh, but the effect was not very obvious, because there was a spiritual energy fluctuation wrapped around the distorted flesh. Although the words of the distorted flesh were suppressed by the flamethrower, it took a step forward in the flames. Is it a protective type of spiritual energy? This thought flashed through Chen Ming's mind, and he suddenly frowned and covered his chest. The boat spirit in his brain seemed to sense something, and took the initiative to leave the brain and come to the position of the heart, protecting Chen Ming from the pressure exerted by the distorted flesh and blood face to face. So Chen Ming didn't need to divide a lot of mental power to protect himself. After feeling that the chest tightness was slightly better, Chen Ming loosened his hand covering his chest and waved it slightly behind him. At this time, the distorted flesh and blood, which seemed to have the upper hand, opened his mouth. "No?" It just said a word, and it was suddenly knocked to the ground by a robot that flew out from behind Chen Ming. Of course, Chen Ming also rubbed the robot on the spot. Originally, Chen Ming wanted to install some explosives on it to explode with the distorted flesh and blood, but he thought that he would not get any good if it exploded underground. So he just installed some electric saw blades and other things. For mechanical arms equipped with saw blades waved on the distorted flesh and blood that were knocked down. For a moment, blood and flesh flew everywhere, and the two arms of the deformed flesh were removed in an instant. But in the next moment, a sudden electromagnetic pulse swept through the passage in front of the institute. This is also the spiritual power of the deformed flesh. However, Chen Ming's robot shook slightly, as if such an electromagnetic pulse of such intensity was just interference to it, and did not completely paralyze it. The power armor Chen Ming was wearing was the same. This is because Chen Ming has just learned something new recently. Some military technology used to defend against electromagnetic pulses, which was obtained from Bai Quan as a deposit. The military, whether it is the 14th Corps or the military of various star regions, their spacecraft shields are very poor. So in many battles, they will choose to turn off the shield and use the spacecraft's armor to resist the damage of weapons. But armor cannot resist electromagnetic pulses. Therefore, the technology of the 14th Corps in this regard is very powerful. What Chen Ming got from Bai Quan was the top-level anti-electromagnetic interference technology. In the past, Chen Ming suffered from lack of education, skills, and money, and the equipment used in the spacecraft he drove did not have this technology. Now it is different. With technology, when facing such problems, you can always find a way to deal with it. Chen Ming did not lose his composure because of the physical and psychological effects, and suppressed the distorted flesh and blood again in a blink of an eye. The robot cut the distorted flesh and blood into sticks in an instant. But the distorted flesh and blood saw that the situation was not right, and a violent electric arc visible to the naked eye flashed on its body. The terrifying power brought by the high voltage was not something that Chen Ming's robot could withstand. In the blink of an eye, the robot fell to the ground with black smoke, although the robot failed to withstand the attack of the distorted hard arc. Fortunately, the remaining arc was also diverted by the metal channels that Chen Ming had condensed along the way, and did not hurt Chen Ming. These metals that had not yet completely solidified under Chen Ming's control still had a very good conductive effect. And several blood vessels like heart arteries suddenly extended from the position of the distorted flesh and blood limbs that fell on the ground, connecting the fallen limbs. After gluing the limbs back, when the flesh and blood grew granulations and began to repair, The distorted flesh and blood opened its mouth again. It hadn't finished speaking. It was knocked down again by the robot that Chen Ming had quietly repaired behind it. However, this time the saw blade made a clanging sound like sawing on metal when it sawed on its flesh and blood. The steel saw blade broke and flew out on the spot, and the broken blade pierced into the flesh and blood on the wall next to it. The flesh and blood opened its twisted mouth again and said, "Defense." But this time it only had one word to say. Chen Ming had immediately replaced the robot with the saw blade made of special metal material in the repair kit that he had been carrying. The robot's mechanical arm swept across, and the head of the deformed flesh and blood fell directly to the ground. For a moment, Chen Ming seemed to see a trace of anger on the face of the deformed flesh and blood, which was only myocardial tissue. It relied on myocardial tissue to force its head to turn on the ground, pulled its vocal cords and said, "Protect?" The words that the deformed flesh and blood had finally said were blocked by Chen Ming again, using a handheld grenade launcher he had just made. The grenade fired was accurately stuffed into the mouth of the deformed flesh and blood head that fell on the ground. The grenade also exploded instantly. The material ratio used in the grenade made by Chen Ming was the same as that used in the Buffalo-level grenade launcher he had just used, but the equivalent was much smaller. It can only be said that he basically does not need to worry about the collapse of the passage when he reinforces this passage. But it is not certain if the power is a little stronger. However, the power at present was enough to completely blow the head of the deformed flesh and blood to pieces, making it unable to utter a single word. The remaining half of its body also burned with raging flames and pulled out on the ground. But suddenly, another arc of electricity knocked away the robot that was pressing on the half of the deformed flesh and blood. At the same time, extremely obvious psychic fluctuations directly wrapped around the gap in the remaining half of its body. The charred part faded away, and the bright red flesh and blood tissue grew out again at a speed visible to the naked eye. The price of such high-speed growth was that the upper half of the deformed flesh and blood completely lost its human appearance, and it was just a bunch of twisted flesh and blood crowded together. However, it still forced a distorted big mouth. "You." The deformed flesh and blood had just started to speak, and Chen Ming's second grenade hit it again. This time, the deformed flesh and blood was not blown to pieces, but was only knocked to the ground by the impact of the explosion, and the damage was basically equal to nil. The robot that Chen Ming had repaired again also rushed forward, but what surprised Chen Ming even more was that the saw blade made of special materials could not saw through its protection. Even the body of the deformed flesh and blood actively overflowed with corrosive blood, and the robot was completely corroded in an instant. All parts of the robot that were touched by the blood became extremely fragile, and any external force would completely break it. Fortunately, the saw blade was not damaged. Chen Ming disassembled the robot that was no longer useful and recovered the most important saw blade. Ordinary robots seemed to have no effect, so Chen Ming could only use some special methods. Before the deformed flesh and blood had time to move, for more robots with external armor emitting the luster of white cloud steel rushed forward together. They did not install offensive weapons such as saw blades, only Chen Ming's thickened armor and more limbs that were convenient for fixing targets. The deformed flesh and blood was immediately unable to move under the embrace of the four robots. It immediately released corrosive blood and flashing arcs again. But several robots have locked each other directly. In addition, Chen Ming is still modifying these robots. The modification method is also very simple, that is, piling up materials. Pure piling up materials, all the materials with decent protective performance are installed at once, regardless of whether they are reasonable or not, and they are all stuffed in. Just rely on the number of materials to trap the distorted flesh and blood in a metal cube. The metal liquid flows in the space inside the cube and gradually penetrates into the body of the distorted flesh and blood. Then, Chen Ming completely solidified these metals and cut the distorted flesh and blood into pieces from the inside. The metal cube was disassembled by Chen Ming, revealing a pool of minced meat mixed with metal fragments, and a few things of Chen Ming that appeared in the minced meat. When Chen Ming just cut the distorted flesh and blood from the inside, he deliberately avoided the core of G3 and his spiritual stone in the body of the distorted flesh and blood. Now it's time to harvest. Chen Ming created another robot and prepared to take these things away. The distorted flesh and blood struggled desperately to barely reassemble a head, and also laboriously constructed a mouth again. The distorted flesh and blood, still only said one word, and the door of the Clone Institute behind it suddenly made a muffled sound. The steel door protruded directly outward, which was a sign of damage caused by brute force. Chen Ming immediately created a wall of white cloud steel in front of him and retreated vigilantly to a safe position where he could withdraw from the passage at any time. Then, an extremely thick flesh and blood tentacle smashed the door of the Institute and hit the robot that was walking towards the distorted flesh and blood, instantly smashing the robot. However, the tentacle did not continue to attack Chen Ming, who was retreating further and further behind, but instead rolled up the distorted flesh and blood that was broken into pieces on the ground. The tentacle wanted to bring it back to the inside of the Institute and merge it with the Institute covered with flesh and blood. Chen Ming could sense that this tentacle had no self-awareness, and there was no other conscious creature in the Institute that produced the tentacle. It seemed that the deformed flesh and blood, which was the core of the entire Institute, had condensed into a human form alone and wanted to communicate with Chen Ming. But every time it spoke, it was blocked by Chen Ming. And even at this moment, before it was brought into the Institute, the deformed flesh and blood still stubbornly struggled to say to Chen Ming with its head, "Mom?" After saying the last word, the deformed flesh and blood seemed to be finally satisfied. The tense myocardial tissues all relaxed, allowing the tentacles to roll it into the roots of the tentacles, that is, the high wall of flesh and blood tissue inside the Institute. Chen Ming had only a question mark on his head at this time. He didn't understand at all. Even if the genetic source of the deformed flesh and blood was him, there was no need to recognize him on the spot, right? But he immediately realized that the last three words said by the deformed flesh and blood were connected. So Chen Ming asked the next door Hui Huang, "Does G3 swear?" Although Hui Huang couldn't see the situation on Chen Ming's side, it did keep in touch with Chen Ming. So it replied quickly and decisively, "Yes." All the language data of Yuhui individuals are imported from the human database. We know all the sentences used in normal language environments, including swear words, but we don't say them under normal circumstances. Now Chen Ming knew why the distorted flesh and blood swore. Sure enough, it learned bad things from G3's core and G3. A distorted creature infected by an existence from another space said a swear word at the cost of its life. It can only be said that it has no style at all. But being dragged back into a pool of rotten meat itself is not a big deal. Although the tentacles have been retracted into the Institute, Chen Ming still keeps a safe distance. After all, the brute force of the tentacle is still dangerous to his fragile body. Anyway, the angle he is in now is just right to see what happened to the distorted flesh and blood after being dragged back, so there is no need to get too close. Chen Ming could see that besides the thick layer of flesh and blood tissue on the wall next to him, there were also many cloned corpses with broken chests stuck together by flesh and blood. There were several thick blood vessels on these clones connected to the wall that had just been integrated with the fragmented, deformed flesh and blood, as if they were supplying nutrients to the wall. Just as Chen Ming carefully checked the surrounding environment, the tentacle suddenly split in half, and the cross-section was wrapped by a large amount of granulation tissue to repair itself into two thinner tentacles, which curled up on the wall. At the edge of the curled tentacles, the wall of the flesh and blood wall suddenly began to bulge. The previously crushed deformed flesh and blood emerged here, gradually forming a deformed heart that Chen Ming had seen several times. And the two split tentacles formed the two blood vessels of this heart. The deformed heart of this research institute suddenly began to beat. The heavy heartbeat seemed to press on Chen Ming's heart with every beat, trying to make Chen Ming's heartbeat gradually become the same as the frequency of the distorted heart. This is not a good thing. Although the ship's spirit has been helping to protect, the effect is not ideal. Chen Ming can still feel that his heart is under heavy pressure. And the closeness from the genetic origin also made Chen Ming's reason gradually fade away. Let Chen Ming even have a feeling that as long as he goes over and touches these flesh and blood, he can control everything around him. However, the sense of danger in Chen Ming's mind is becoming more and more obvious at this time, so that he can still clearly realize that this is an illusion. As long as he dares to go over, there will be only one consequence: being assimilated by these flesh and blood tissues. As the distorted flesh and blood were dragged back to the Institute by the tentacles, the distorted flesh and blood merged with the Institute, and Chen Ming had to face all kinds of troubles that gave him a headache for a while. But a smile appeared on his face under the power armor helmet, because he has already realized that the core of the entire research institute is the huge heart after the deformed flesh and blood merged. Kill him, and his purpose of coming down will be achieved, and the needs of the ship's spirit can be met. Although Chen Ming does not know what benefits there are in satisfying it, but his instinct will not deceive him, and the ship's spirit that coexists with him will not deceive him either. And Chen Ming basically does not understand psychic matters, so it will not be wrong to listen to instinct and the ship's spirit. So now there is only one step left to achieve his goal. At this moment, Chen Ming suddenly noticed that a large amount of flesh and blood tissue appeared behind him at some point, and they spread out from the gaps between the soil, trying to block Chen Ming's retreat. But what Chen Ming did before was not in vain. He clearly knew that the channel itself was made of metal, and after dealing with the flesh and blood tissue, the remaining channel seemed to have no need to be covered with metal liquid. It seems a bit redundant, but he still did it. And the current situation is the reason why he did so. Chen Ming forcibly solidified the metal liquid left in the channel behind him, completely covering the channel, not giving the flesh and blood tissues a chance to close the channel. Flesh and blood and steel were squeezing each other's living space, and these flesh and blood, with the blessing of distorted flesh and blood spiritual energy, could even gain a slight advantage in the confrontation with steel. Chen Ming thought for a moment, and used spiritual energy to directly pour a large amount of molten iron into the entire channel, completely sealing it. Anyway, he could dismantle these steels to open the channel at any time. But these flesh and blood tissues wanted to drill through the metal pillars with a diameter of at least 3 meters away, which could only be said to be a thought. The flesh and blood tissues soon calmed down, and it was not known whether they thought it was hopeless to dismantle the metal pillars, or whether they thought that their purpose of blocking Chen Ming's way had been achieved. However, the heart that had been beating silently on the wall in the distance suddenly moved. A crack suddenly appeared on the surface of the heart, and blood spurted out and fell on the flesh and blood on the ground, and was absorbed back by it. However, Chen Ming's focus now is not on the blood, but on the heart that has been torn apart by the deformed flesh. What he saw in the crack was not the bloody myocardial tissue, but a dark abyss emitting little scarlet starlight. No, the thing in the crack is more like a starry sky than an abyss. And after sensing Chen Ming's gaze, this starry sky suddenly emitted a terrifying suction. It was not a physical suction, but a consciousness suction. Before Chen Ming could react, in the blink of an eye, he found that the environment around him had changed dramatically. He returned to the steel jungle under the deep starry sky that he had entered in a coma, and he was now on the top of a small hill in the middle of the forest where the wreckage of the spacecraft was piled up. With the previous experience, Chen Ming instantly realized that his consciousness was dragged here. This is the most original place of psychic consciousness. And when Chen Ming came here this time, he also found that the wreckage of his iron ore also appeared on the hill composed of the wreckage of the spacecraft, and it was at the top of the hill. However, when Chen Ming just saw the wreckage of the iron ore, the wreckage under his feet was suddenly completely covered by a phantom. After Chen Ming sensed his own psychic fluctuations entangled in the phantom wandered around the iron ore. The iron ore, which was still a wreck, seemed to have been repaired by his psychic power and restored to a brand new appearance. The engine started and took off. Chen Ming also successfully entered the iron ore through the top hatch of the iron ore and came to the captain's room. Obviously, this scene was caused by the ship's spirit, which appeared in this place that was probably Chen Ming's consciousness space. Since it temporarily gave up protecting Chen Ming's heart and came here, it means Chen Ming controlled the iron ore to fly high in the sky and looked into the distance. Before, Chen Ming was in the steel jungle and could not see the whole picture of the jungle, but now he can see it clearly. The steel jungle is an isolated island floating in the surrounding starry sky environment. At the edge of the isolated island, a disgusting mass of flesh and blood has already clung to it. The flesh and blood are spreading, and the steel is being corroded. This is an attack from the distorted flesh and blood. This is the most essential spiritual power collision between psychics. Chen Ming suddenly had such an understanding again in his heart. This kind of spiritual power collision is different from the normal spiritual power converted into concrete spiritual power and then colliding. It can ignore the specific effects of spiritual power and only look at the most basic and essential spiritual power of psychics and psychic creatures. Let the owners of offensive spiritual power and the owners of auxiliary spiritual power stand on the same starting line. Although Chen Ming doesn't know what the distorted flesh and blood thinks, but since it's like this, then Chen Ming had to show his mental power, which he had trained by exhausting his mental power every day for nearly a year, and sleeping with the falsehood stone that could kill people just by touching it. Although Chen Ming didn't know much about this space of consciousness, he couldn't control the wreckage of the spacecraft and couldn't directly bomb it with a cruiser. But Chen Ming still knew the simplest mental power scheduling. And what Chen Ming did in terms of psychic power at this time was shown in a more practical situation in this steel jungle. As Chen Ming concentrated his mental power, he used it to force back the distorted flesh and blood that seemed to have invaded his consciousness. Countless broken steel rolled back from this jungle, rushing towards the flesh and blood tissue growing on the edge of the isolated island like a tsunami. Although a lot of steel was smashed by the flesh and blood tentacles extended by the distorted flesh and blood, more metal fragments were inserted into its flesh and blood, causing extremely considerable damage. For a time, the flesh and blood tissue that was like a tumor parasitic on the edge of the isolated island was shaky and could fall out of this starry sky at any time. But suddenly, Chen Ming's face turned extremely pale. He sensed a real danger, an extremely terrifying danger. So far, Chen Ming had only sensed this level of danger when he was sitting on the iron or an was almost brushed by the particle torrent of the tachyon spear when he was at the pirate space station during the attack by the afterglow. And the source of the danger he encountered now? Chen Ming looked up at the farther reaches of the starry sky. Something seemed to be coming outside the starry sky of his conscious world. Cold sweat appeared on Chen Ming's forehead. He no longer used his mental power to steadily roll up the steel, but directly released the maximum mental power he could mobilize at one time. A corner of the steel jungle was directly bald, and the flesh and blood tissue clinging to the edge of the isolated island also fell completely in the steel storm and disappeared into the starry sky. As the sense of danger gradually faded, Chen Ming's consciousness instantly returned to himself. The starry sky crack on the giant distorted heart in front of him had disappeared, leaving only a real tear wound. Chen Ming gasped subconsciously, adjusting his heartbeat which had unknowingly been rapid. What had just given him a sense of danger must be the thing in another space that the boss had mentioned before. It came here following the location of the distorted flesh and blood. No wonder the distorted flesh and blood wanted to pull him into the consciousness space, just to pull the thing behind it over. Fortunately, Chen Ming reacted quickly, otherwise the iron ingot would be in trouble. Chen Ming breathed a sigh of relief and concentrated again. The biggest trouble had been dealt with quickly by him, and now there was only one problem left to be solved. His eyes seemed to be able to see through the surface of the heart of the distorted flesh and blood, and locked directly on the two spiritual stones that were providing energy for the heart to move. Chen Ming could actually always sense the existence of the false talk stone, but it was vague when he was on the surface before. And now, as Chen Ming approached a certain distance from the false talk stone, this vague feeling no longer affected Chen Ming. Even if the false talk stone was inside the heart in the distance, Chen Ming could still clearly sense it. Moreover, it can still be controlled. The psychic fluctuations of the deformed flesh and blood tissue itself cannot block Chen Ming's perception of the false talk stone at all, nor can it completely control the false talk stone. Although it has a large range of psychic fluctuations, and even because of this large range of psychic fluctuations, It has disturbed the surrounding environment. But after Chen Ming personally experienced it, all these can only be said to be false. These are all the chaotic properties of the deformed flesh and blood itself, which are aggregated by various deformed individuals, and some effects that it cannot control at all appear on its own. If the deformed flesh and blood has a sufficient growth environment, and there are enough people and creatures for it to grow, then these special properties may be really difficult to solve under its ability to control. But now, with these clones, the deformed flesh and blood that are barely composed of flesh and blood can only be said to have no such ability at all. Then what Chen Ming has to do is also very simple. Activate the false talk stone, which is the energy source of the deformed flesh and blood, with the highest intensity. Didn't your father teach you not to eat anything carelessly? Oh, I really didn't teach you that. After Chen Ming recognized his relatives, he directly activated the liar stone, which was slowly outputting spiritual energy fluctuations, by using the spiritual energy connection method he had mastered after achieving resonance with the spiritual stone. The maddening, seemingly tangible, harmful spiritual energy, Li, instantly spread in the small underground space. Although Li itself had no effect on these twisted and chaotic flesh and blood tissues, the extremely strong spiritual energy fluctuations still caused them to suffer unprecedented stimulation and damage. In particular, Chen Ming was using his own mental power as an amplifier to increase the intensity of spiritual energy fluctuations. Not to mention that the distorted flesh and blood directly placed the liar stone in his body. All the high-intensity damaging psychic fluctuations were fully absorbed. The heart overflowed with a large amount of black blood from the wound that had been torn open before. The heart was also beating violently at this time, and the frequency of beating doubled. However, the pressure brought to Chen Ming's heart by this rapid beating was not as great as before. Chen Ming could still see that the bodies of the clones tied up by flesh and blood around him were all beginning to shrivel up, and even a large amount of flesh and blood tissue around them was also becoming shriveled. It was as if the heart was being sucked of life to make up for the damage caused by the falsehood stone. The violent heartbeat suddenly began to affect Chen Ming again, causing Chen Ming's heartbeat to become chaotic again. But fortunately, the ship's spirit appeared again in time to protect Chen Ming. Several tentacles grew out of the crack in the heart, flashing with arcs and waving wildly, trying to get close to Chen Ming and kill him. But Chen Ming had foresightly run far away before. Now that he saw that the situation was not right, he immediately dismantled the passage that he had previously blocked with a large amount of metal materials and continued to retreat. At the same time, new robots appeared beside him and pounced on the tentacles that were extending. This time, in addition to installing electromagnetic interference equipment on the robots, Chen Ming also modified some voltage protection measures to mitigate the current type spiritual energy mastered by the distorted flesh and blood. Although it cannot be said that it can resist more, at least it will not be directly electrocuted in one encounter. And these 4 robots did successfully help Chen Ming to entangle several tentacles. And in this process, the damage of the false speech stone to the distorted flesh and blood is still increasing. But the distorted flesh and blood dare not give up the false speech stone at will. Once it gives up, it will completely lose the ability to move. Now it can only try to use the countless flesh and blood inside to squirm frantically on the surface of the false speech stone, trying to infiltrate its spiritual energy into the false speech stone. But the false speech stone that resonates with Chen Ming is not so easy to contact. Under the desperate operation of the distorted flesh and blood, more flesh and blood inside the entire institute became shriveled. Even the tentacles that came to attack Chen Ming all collapsed and fell limply. The heartbeat frequency of the deformed flesh and blood gradually slowed down after the intense stimulation. It was not that it recovered, but that it could no longer bear it. The extremely weak, deformed flesh and blood completely lost the ability to resist, and even the heart itself was gradually shrinking. Feeling the sense of danger faded, Chen Ming approached the research institute again. Standing at the extreme distance, he raised the flamethrower. The flames burned on the heart again. This time, The deformed flesh and blood formed by the heart tissues that generated psychic energy from different clones could no longer use its protective psychic energy. Soon the whole heart was burned by the flames, leaving only a piece of charcoal. And in this piece of charcoal, the alpha-class core of G3, Chen Ming's 2 spiritual stones were lying safely in it.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe.